So, let's see, and 9/11, you guys were already living in Santa Paula at that time, right? For like a few months.
Yes, we were, yeah.
Were you still teaching at that time?
I was, yeah.
Right. So, you were actually at school when it happened?
No, because it happened in the morning in New York, so it happened 3 hours earlier.
I see.
Here. So the way
it
Dad and I
would've
found
been-
out about it is that Dad's clock radio would go off as a radio, as his alarm. So like someone started talking. And what started talking was something like an airline jumbo jet a plane has just flown into the World Trade Center.
God.
And Dad was like, is this a replay of that thing?
Is that going wrong?
There was a news story of like a little teeny plane, like a Santa Paula
It just goes.
airport plane. Previously, like 5 years before, a little plane like that had accidentally
It
flown
just
into the
goes
World
big.
Trade and had accidentally flown into the World Trade
Yeah.
Center. Dad was like, is this the anniversary of the day that happened?
Why would they do that
playing
again?
it?
It
Yeah,
wasn't
like he was so
terribly
confused.
significant.
And then we kept listening and I realized, oh, this seems real. And then like another airplane has just flown into the World Trade Center. I think two.
Two airplanes on the same
I can't
day.
really remember. So
I
you have to
imagine
look up
like the
history
sequential
now.
nature, there was not really any telling what would happen next, right?
Because the first one was clearly not. The first one was
Clearly, it seemed like one.
right.
No one
But
does that
wasn't
on
there two
purpose.
that went into the World Trade
If there are two that went in, then
right? And
Yikes.
then, and is that true that that's what happened? That's what
yeah,
memory
I
is.
think one went into each, or maybe
Yeah.
two went into both, and they knocked down the other one.
And then what happened? Then
So
we heard that one. Now we're getting ready for work. We still have to go to work.
Yeah,
Then we
but
heard that one
no.
is crashing into the Pentagon. And we're like, what
Oh,
is happening?
what's
And,
gonna-
like you
is
suddenly
the whole
realize like
country falling apart?
yeah. And at first it was like, is there something wrong with our? We're so innocent, right? Control towers, like what's going on? And then suddenly we realized that it was some kind of like terrorist attack, you know. But
Yeah.
none of that had ever happened before, because before when terrorists would take over an airplane, they would drive it to a different airport and then hold everybody hostage to get something they wanted. Like, we're gonna hold these 200 people hostage until you release our prisoners from your prison camps or something like that. There was always like something like that.
Or you want you to fly them somewhere in particular, and that's why you were always supposed to give in.
But they'd never had it before where terrorists were committing suicide.
Just flying the plane smack into the.
So that was really
towers.
bizarre. But then I went to school and I taught school, but then we had recess.
You have to explain it to them.
The kids were a little bit oblivious, which was good. But then at
That's
recess,
early.
which is only 15 minutes long, I can't remember if a teacher had pulled the TV into her room and had it on, and she called us in, or if we went to the staff room. It's all a little bit blurry. I remember being with other teachers during that 15-minute recess.
This was in Fillmore. You were teaching them.
Yeah,
Okay.
and watching on the screen when the first tower fell. Because at first they were trying to just put out the fire, and then all of a sudden you just see it collapse, like
Ooh,
like
what the heck?
like a
It
like
doesn't.
a tower made of powder.
It just
was
doesn't make
so bizarre.
because it's huge.
And again, I can't remember the timeline. Maybe by then, maybe only then, we just heard that somebody flew in the Pentagon. But it was this scary feeling of like, our world is falling apart.
Everything's
Like,
collapsing.
our nation's under attack.
Is this the end time?
I have to go teach school in 15
Again?
minutes, right? And some of the
Life
children
as
had heard
usual.
something, some hadn't. Nobody really knew what was going on. So
What grade were you teaching then?
I was teaching second grade.
Okay,
Yeah.
pretty young.
I think I was teaching second grade. Was I teaching first grade?
Don't know. But yeah, that makes sense then if they didn't.
No, I was
really get
teaching first grade.
What was going on?
Yeah.
Gosh.
And then only then did we find out in drips and drabs, like, again, because it all seems so crazy. Because it didn't line up with any of our former understandings of how these worked, right? Terrorists had put out bombs, for the Boston Marathon, or they'd take people hostage, but they never done this. And then it kind of came out in drips and drabs, like, so later that day, when then I wasn't watching any media again from like 10:30 in the morning until when I got home in the
gosh,
afternoon, or like on my car radio on the way home, because of the kind of job I had. We didn't have
Yeah,
access
of
to that
course.
kind of thing. And then we heard about the tragedy in Pennsylvania, and that the
Gosh,
plane
that
had
was
taken
the
off.
one where they revolted, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And the heroism of that, and that the husband who led that charge said to his, all these people started calling their spouse. They said, terrorists have taken over our plane. We don't know where they're taking us. And all their loved ones were saying, we know what they're doing.
Oh my
Terrorists have already
goodness.
rammed 2 airplanes in the World
So
Trade
that
Center.
was
you're gonna go, you're gonna die, like you're gonna be crashing.
Holy cow.
And so then this group of men, and one of them, I want to say he was maybe, again, sorry, my historian's
No,
perspective,
it's good.
it's kind of like
This
random.
is
I think he
your
was like a
perspective.
fireman, or he was some kind of like, had some kind of brave job. And he was a young husband and father, like in his 30s or something, on the Pennsylvania plain. And he said, okay, we can't save ourselves, but we can save whoever they're going to ram this plane into.
Moment that must have been.
Right? And so he said, we're gonna go into that cockpit and get those guys. But all they had were their belts, because things were so already
Sorry.
so. It's okay. I think it's okay. I think it's my friend Jane Shai, but so I think all they had were their belts, and they took off their belts and they decided they would attack the terrorists from behind. Terrorists probably had guns, right?
Yeah.
Oh, because that's what they've already witnessed. They already witnessed the terrorists getting up with guns, tying up all the stewardesses,
They knew they
getting
had-
into
yeah.
the cockpit, right? They already knew they had these weapons. So they so bravely. So he said, "Okay, baby, are you recording this?" In certain parts of the Quran, just like you can pick and choose cherry pick things out of the Bible,
Which
right?
is the way so many heresies started.
Right, a lot of violent things from the Quran, and so it created a lot of
Oh
sorrow
yeah, a
and
lot.
stress. And then they had to figure out how these guys get trained to fly our airplanes. And it turned out they were allowed to take pilot lessons at Venice Airport in Florida, where
Oh,
Omi and
goodness.
Grampy lived, where there were no like background checks or anything like that. And the instructor said it was so weird. These 4 guys came. They were from another country, and they never wanted to learn how to take off or land. They only wanted to learn how to steer. They only wanted to learn how to turn.
No one thought that was suspicious.
Right? But like, we're all so dumb.
That's
like,
the thing.
now
No
we
one
think
thought
it's
of
suspicious,
airplane
right?
attacks. There was no like real
But the
TSA
instructor said, we
security,
just thought
right?
that was so weird, because what everybody wants to know is how to take off and land. But these guys were obsessed with learning
Planes
how to
don't
turn.
just
But
fly.
they were never going to have to take off or land. Right? The pilots would take off, they would storm the cockpits, and then they would have to steer.
My
So
goodness.
anyway, it was a real horrible time, obviously,
That's
for
really
America.
scary, and it's frightening.
Yeah, and what
Yeah,
happened,
just imagine.
it was more of a success than the terrorists ever expected in the World Trade Center, because they never expected that the amount, or maybe they did, but they were carrying so much jet fuel that the heat of the fire was so intense that it melted the steel inside the World Trade Center. Nobody
didn't
thought that
do
that
that.
could. It was supposed to be a
Wow.
somewhat indestructible building.
Mm-hmm.
But the fire affected so many floors, and Lisa has a friend whose husband died in the World Trade Center that day and left children, 3 and 1 year old or something.
That's awful.
And there are thousands of stories like that,
There's like, I remember seeing a picture once of like actually caught at the perfect moment of a man jumping out and falling. There are several.
Out of hysteria, right? I mean, they knew they would die, but jumping to their death. They were faced with, do I get killed by the fire that's coming behind me, or by that fall that's coming before me?
Do you think? So you were really new here when this happened. Did you know a lot of people here in Santa Paula? How did they react?
I didn't know very many people in Santa Paula, so that's a very deep answer. I know that Daddy, and especially his sisters, knew a lot of people on the East.
Mm-hmm.
Uncle Jim was actually supposed to be in a meeting at the World Trade Center that morning, but it was Theo's first day of preschool.
Oh my goodness.
And he went with Aunt Sonia to Theo's first day of preschool.
What?
Remember Father Nisrali one time saying on the anniversary of 9/11, I think he had like an uncle or something who was a firefighter who died from the smoke in his lungs.
Yeah.
Whoa.
There were a lot of firefighters who died that day. The New York City Fire Department responded so bravely. There's stories of a
Remarkable.
priest who went through
Wait.
giving last rites. I
Whose
think he might
father-
have died.
Father Apostoli?
I don't know.
No. He was there. He was a chaplain, but he lived and wrote books and stuff.
Oh, maybe
He's
that's
in charge of
it.
Blessed Shane's canonization college.
Oh, neat.
So
Maybe that's the problem
that's a different.
of my
That might be a
memory.
different. I'm sure there were multiple
No,
priests,
I'm sure.
But-
I'm sure you're right.
and it could be more. Probably a lot.
I just had that feeling like nobody was gonna happen.
Ooh, helplessness.
Yeah. And
Because it succeeded. It happened so fast, right? It was like Hitler's lightning wars
yeah,
that
it
just seemed
happened so
unstoppable.
fast. People are still kind of curious about how the first one happened, and was it an accident, and did the pilot fall asleep at the helm? Like, what happened when the second one hit?
Yeah.
And what else? Doug Cohen, a good friend of Daddy's family, was also in the World Trade Center. He was in there that day, and he escaped.
Oh my goodness.
But I don't know if he has now, but for years he refused to talk about what he experienced that day. Yeah.
What changed after? When was the first time you flew again after that happened?
That's a good question. Probably sometime the next year. And I remember being scared.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of, I'm kind of prone to being scared anyway, but they had a lot of new safety regulations, like, after that, on all big airplanes that had a lot of jet fuel, they always had an undercover armed policeman.
Oh,
so
yeah.
that if there were that kind of attack.
And they still have, like, the air marshals, right?
But these, you never even knew who was the guy, so that was good for deterrent. They also had special new locks on cockpits because before that was not deemed necessary, such that the stewardess, it used to be the stewardess could like come in and bring the captain drinks and food and stuff, and now there's a mechanism such that the cockpit is locked at takeoff and cannot be opened until. What else? Oh, and then they have these new regulations, like you couldn't bring razor blades, or what you could bring in your carry-on was much reduced.
Was it already like what we experience today, or was it still evolving?
Much more. I mean,
it was more?
I'm sorry. What we experience today is not quite as strict as what we started to experience in 2002, but what we experience today is much more strict than pre-2001.
Well, you could go right up to the gate with someone if you weren't flying,
You could go
right?
to the gate. You could meet somebody at their gate. You never take off your shoes. Taking off your shoes to go through security was new.
Yeah.
Taking off belts and all your stuff was new. And even just the amount of liquid you can take on an airplane was never.
Now they make you empty the water well and refill it on the other side, right?
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. It took days and weeks for the truth to come out and the identity of these people.
It's frightening.
And I remember after that, George Bush was president. He said things like, we need all our citizens to be on alert. Now, he was like a farmer from a farming family in Texas. And so people said, what do you mean? Like, what can an average citizen do? And he said, if you see a stranger getting into a crop duster in your town, you call the authorities.
Oh my God.
Such a funny example.
I don't know the pilot of the crop duster. He could be anybody.
Like, what's the crop duster going to do compared to what these guys did?
That's a very Texan example.
But his point was, I thought that was funny. But his point was that every single person has a role to play. And the patriotism after that was so beautiful, Sebastian. Every home was flying a flag. Every car had stickers and bumper stickers. People really were extra kind and good to each other, and a lot of divisions in our country ceased. You wouldn't even imagine compared to today when there are so many divisions.
Yeah, and then in COVID it made them worse and not better.
Maybe, yeah. And instead the country just really pulled together and And I remember President George Bush kept saying, "Never again on my watch, never again on my watch." Well, he didn't take blame for it. He did say that he thought they could do a lot of new things going forward. Yeah. It was a real embarrassment too that the CIA or whatever, whoever's supposed to be in charge of this, kind of missed this,
The Venice airport just gave these random guys flight lessons, and they never wanted to learn how to land or take off. I mean, again, it seems like a hard result to foresee, but it also seems like something you ought to ask about.
Yeah. And even they also started doing this thing on airplanes. I don't know if they do it anymore, but it was called profiling. And so you'd go through security, which now took forever, and they really beefed up. It even gave a new name to airport security.
TSA?
Yeah, but if you met a profile, i.e. if you were a young man in your 20s, if you were from a foreign country, if you were from a third world country, you often would be pulled aside and put and given extra scrutiny. And that was considered slightly undemocratic, but at the same time, people were saying, look,
there's a case to be made.
Right? And honestly, men who looked Hispanic could instead be Muslims from Arabia. There was a similar look, right? But it was a pretty awful, that was an awful underbelly side.
Yeah.
So then they got criticized for that, so they said, okay, then we'll also start pulling every fourth person. And I remember one time I was traveling with Daddy and little kids at some point, and I was the fourth person, and they pulled me and they took me to an extra room, and Dad was like, oh my gosh, this woman traveling with like baby bottles and yogurt, you know. But they said, look, anybody could have any kind of disguise, and a lot of that has, I think even it was ended up being found unconstitutional, but
Yeah.
it was foreign travel was like
super strict.
foreigners traveling the U.S. had a much harder time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Anything?
No, it kind of just launched this thing called the War on Terror, which nobody really understood.
It was never really one war.
How can you define that? Where do you fight it?
They tried to. The objectives were like kill Saddam Hussein and all the other guys.
Yeah.
And that like ended like in 2021, right? With the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was when it was really said to come to an end. I don't really know it either.
I know if you can
Yeah,
consider
this is
kind of
all that deep.
controversial, like should we go get Saddam Hussein? Like, and what were the terrorist group that was behind this?
It's very nebulous.
Right? So there are some white people. I remember Aunt Kelly and Uncle Tim were like, we can't fight murder with murder. Like, I think that was a really smart thing to say, but Dad and I were a little more ignorant. And
Yeah.
we're like, oh, we have to do something. And they're like, oh, but what if the something is bad? And it was a really good
Yeah.
deep conversation.
And memes and whatnot.